Good evening. From our headquarters in Kiev, this is the Sunday show on Hromadske International, the only prime-time TV program explaining the East European geopolitical turmoil for you in English. I'm Andrei Kulikov, and tonight on the Sunday show. Russia just finished voting for their new president. We go live from Moscow. Did Ukraine's security service secretly detain people with pro-Russian views? We believe so, and we have the evidence. What's going on in Slovakia? We speak to an expert as the country sees its biggest protests in decades. We speak to Canadians who traveled all the way to Ukraine to train the military. Russians have just finished voting for the new, or is it old, president. It is almost certain that Mr. Putin has got another presidential term. Our correspondent Nataliya Gumenyuk is in Moscow, so we are joined now by Nataliya Gumenyuk, and you've been there all day. Nataliya, what was the most striking thing that you've seen?
Just to explain to our audience, I'm in the election headquarters of Sobchak, a popular TV presenter and opposition politician who, according to the official data, has got not more than 1.69% of the votes, yet she is probably the brightest of the candidates. Also should say that Alexei Navalny wasn't allowed to run, and he asked for the boycott of these elections, while Vladimir Putin, of course, according to the recent polls, has up to 72% of the Russians who voted for him more than 6 years ago. But the main point was this: there is no doubt that this election was without any competition. And even if you talk to the independent members of the observers campaign and independent members of the election commissions in Moscow, I'm talking to a lot of other people, there was no any doubt that Vladimir Putin would be the president. So the question was, so what? Why it should be? The main and the most important, what is striking, that there was no any political campaign running by the Kremlin. There was no any political economic message. Probably the conflict with Britain regarding the assassination of the Skripal, former intelligence, Russian intelligence officer, was the #1 topic by the last day. Yet the main story was about the turnout. A lot of people compared these elections, to the Soviet time when the factories, the employees of different companies, especially of the state companies, were just called to come to the polls. I went to a number of the polling stations, and there were the food festivals. There was the different nice things when the people could get a ticket to a concert for the fact that they will show up. And that was the only Kremlin strategy, to make people to come. So far, or what we know after some just minutes after the close, an hour after the polls are closed, officially it's up to 65% of the people who had come to vote. Yet it might be less more. So it's more or less guessing to what extent the government overdone. The Kremlin has really shown that this support is bigger than it is. What is interesting, that probably the biggest interesting story for me was really to talk to those independent observers and all kind of the activists who are still taking care about the fairness and transparency of these elections. So their answer is actually that yes, we know there is no choice, but we are trying to at least not to lose this institute of the elections, because there would be the mayor election, the municipal election, and at that time, at least the citizens would know how is it to vote, so that they wouldn't lose this practice.
Nataliya, how easy was it for you to access polling stations, and how they treat independent and foreign journalists at all?
If we speak about the work of the, first of all, I also should add about some kind of a different types of the fraud which have taken place. Not that much in Moscow, but around the country, and we had really the cases when the ballots had been pushed like in mass. We have the knowledge of some kind of thing like what was named like the Sultanate of elections, the regions like Chechnya, Ingushetia, Dagestan, where actually the turnout is extremely high. But I talked to the journalists who went there, and they agreed that most of the people indeed support Vladimir Putin. And I think the most popular discussion among the political analysts here and the journalists here is probably the confession of one of the spin doctors of the Kremlin, who said that since 1996, the Russians had been, the government of Russia had used the only tactic to prove and to say, to argue that there is no any alternative. There is no any alternative to the current president, and it's already 22 years for how long that is happening. That this belief is still there. One thing to mention, that Ksenia Sobchak, whom you see right now, had started a political party, and she asked Alexei Navalny to join the kind of the constructive fight against the government, not boycotting it. They've been live on the YouTube channel, extremely popular by Alexei Navalny, who is an anti-corruption activist, and that was pretty a nasty fight. He was very, I would say, really not nice to her, accusing her of being a puppet for just participating in this election. So the biggest discussion between Russian opposition is really how to fight the system. Really, should we kind of be co-opted? Should we cooperate in some way using the legal tools? Or should we just get out of the system? And that's probably where we can
Nataliya, who of the candidates have already conceded the election? Who have already said, we lost, long live Mr. Putin?
I think that there is no even, that is the interesting part of this election, that the moment when usually people expect the result, nobody in fact cared who would win, because it was, even for the opposition candidate, kind of a usual thing. They are rather competing between themselves. Some would say like, okay, I know about one candidate, Suraikin, whose name probably says nothing to a lot of people. He said like, oh, I don't have kind of a couple of percent, I have like 7 or 8. But the main thing is, in fact, just everybody confessed this election was not about the elected president. It's about like just showing that in this system where some of the candidates weren't allowed to run, in this system where the whole propaganda machine is supporting one candidate for years and years, they were participating for the access, for the tribune, for the access of the federal TV channels, for the at least an opportunity to speak against use this campaign for that. Because as I would remind, 72, it's more or less nothing against 2%. That's how big is the difference. Yet still it's worth it to watch, and it's still worth it to look at this, just to understand that indeed it's a bit of a stalemate. There would be 6 years of Vladimir Putin again, but of course there is some very, I think that there was a pretty gloomy mood in Moscow a couple of days ago. Today is still it's the end of the campaign, so people are happy it's over. In a couple of hours, Vladimir Putin probably would be near the Kremlin speaking in front of the crowd. That's what is expected, but that's not yet fully planned, so that's how it's running.
Thank you, Nataliya. Nataliya Gumenyuk of Hromadske was on our Skype connection with our studio in Kiev. And earlier she spoke to Roman Udot, co-chair of the board at Golos, a movement in defense of voters' rights in Russia. Let's take a look at what he had to say about the election day.
It's early hours yet to talk about fraud. Fraud is not that found easily. We still observe and have been observing since the beginning of the campaign inequality of the candidates, and when authorities remove popular alternative candidates, they have another problem, because democracy is double-edged sword. When you play with the candidacies, with alternative candidacies, you are cut by low turnout and questionable legitimacy. So now the authorities are fighting for turnout. They organized, like it was in Soviet times, the cheap sellout of cheap products, entertainment, singing, dancing, whatever is possible in -11 on Moscow streets. And they are doing it to raise turnout, and they do it through the municipal factories, enterprises, through other means. They organize discount leaflets of at least I saw on the table in the polling commission, polling stations, leaflets with the discounts for whatever sort of services you like, just beauty salon, dentist services, any all way is used to do it to raise the turnout. That was a series of unpleasant surprises. First of all, we were attacked after we found that volunteers of the victory, Putin's volunteers, were paid actually by the government. And it's not allowed by the Russian law to campaign, to use during campaigning the paid work. If you are a worker, if you are a person, you can do it as a volunteer. But if you are legal entity, it's forbidden. It's forbidden. You should be paid in full, even on the market level. So in this case, the first crackdown on Golos happened after that finding. Then we showed in the presidential administration statistical data that was another problem for them. We were blamed like falsifiers, like charlatans, and so on. Recently, two our European partners were branded as unwanted organizations. It's a Russian way of saying banned organizations, and we are not under threat of the criminal punishment, are able to cooperate with them. And finally, when we were trying to find premises for this group of people, we found premises, several cases, several options, and after visits from the police department, one option after one option fell off. So this one was done exactly as it was described on TV. It was in clandestine spy style. When I switched off my phone, when I organized the legal interbank transaction without actual transaction, because the first premises were found by bank transaction. Sberbank is run by state, and so in this case they were on the next day after the payment they have found our spot.
All eyes have been on Russia this month, but the presidential election is not the only reason the country has been making headlines around the world. An assassination attempt on former Russian intelligence agent Sergei Skripal on British soil has triggered an escalating diplomatic crisis between Russia and the West. Earlier, Hromadske sat down with a Russian journalist and TV Rain anchor Mikhail Fishman to discuss both the election and the diplomatic tensions between Moscow and the United Kingdom.
I think that this upcoming election is specific from the point of view that it's the first election when Vladimir Putin doesn't have to fight. He has no one to struggle with anymore. He is already a total winner. And the question of power was the most important question for Vladimir Putin during his entire stay at the helm. starting from 2000. But at every single moment, his power, his authority was not absolute. There was still opposition. There was still oppositional elites around him. There was still he had to constrain media. He had to constrain governors, oligarchs. He was always fighting for his future on the top of Russian power structure. And now this fight is over. It's over for already, I would say, at least a couple of years. I'd say that he achieved this new status that he doesn't see any threat to his own ambition and to his own status after Trump won the election in America, because he was really scared. That's my strong belief, that Hillary Clinton, if she would win the election, would build this united Western front, and he would still have to fight this joint and very powerful enemy. With Trump, it's not the case. And since then, he relaxed. This battle is over. And so this election is about nothing since then, because it only will sort of confirm this status quo in which Vladimir Putin is the one and only authority, absolutely unaccountable to any kind of force and absolutely unpredictable, with any kind of decision-making existing only in his head and nothing else. And that's this kind of new situation that we have for some time already, which will be confirmed this Sunday during the election with its predictable outcome.
And being very brief, so what what are the main issues for the Kremlin today, especially still speaking about the elections? As a Ukrainian, I would ask to what extent the war in Donbass, the Crimea, or even Syria is discussed, is considered. What are the things which are on the core of the campaign?
You're talking about what's the campaign's agenda?
Agenda.
I'd say it's most up to this, until this crisis with London, its most important, visible, and impressive point was this presentation during the so-called State of the Union address of Vladimir Putin, when he presented this new nuclear weaponry and arsenal. That's when we got finally what this sort of election, if it can be called an election, is about. The war in Syria was triumphantly ended again by Vladimir Putin in December, so it's over, and it's perceived in Russia as a great success, for sure. Ukraine is not really something that is part of this campaign or some part of political agenda. It's not a campaign, it's a political agenda that is being built before our eyes, but it's not, I believe, totally connected to the election. Well, of course, yes, there are these goals and tasks of turnout and votes delivered from Vladimir Putin, but Vladimir Putin himself and his aides, they think about something else. They think about what they're gonna do, and it's not connected to this election, not so ever.
For the full version of this interview, as well as for other pieces of our extensive coverage of Russian elections, go to our website and you'll see that 24/7 we deliver latest news, not only from around the world, but from specific countries as well. And we'll be back in this studio in a sec. Back in 2016, two international organizations published a report that stated that both on the government-controlled and Russian separatist-controlled territory of Ukraine, there were secret detention facilities for different people, obviously. According to the report, Ukraine's security service set up secret facilities to detain people who were accused of having pro-Russian sentiments and views, or who took part in organizing so-called referendums back in 2014, which proclaimed the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. The SBU has denied this. However, Hromadske has gathered enough evidence to state that this did happen. We are joined in this studio by Angelina Koryakina, the editor-in-chief of Hromadske, who is one of the authors of this film, shown just 2 days ago on Hromadske. However, before I ask you the first question, let's see the abridged version of this film.
People have stated that they were arrested by representatives of various security agencies on Ukrainian territory in December 2014 and at the start of January 2015. According to them, they were all handed over to representatives of the Ukrainian Security Service and held in the defunct Kharkiv SBU compound for more than a year. But do these secret compounds really exist? In July 2016, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch stated that 13 people had been released from the SBU compounds in Kharkiv. 2 of them are from the small town of Ukrainsk in the Donetsk region. This is Viktor Shichman. He was working at the mine in his hometown. But according to him, in May 2014, he was asked to organize a so-called referendum in the so-called Donetsk People's Republic.
The movement for the referendum started here. Representatives from the so-called Donetsk People's Republic came to us on May 1st. A lot of people gathered, there were some speeches. And then they started to ask who would be able to help with the referendum. When they found out I was a former Ukrainian city councillor, they asked me to help with this. I thought there was nothing wrong in that. I ended up carrying out the referendum. Actually, that's what I was accused of. And on December 7th, in the middle of the night, there was a knock at the door. I opened, and standing there were these guys in balaclavas. There were 6 of them in total in front of the porch. Does Viktor Alexeyevich live here? Yes, I said, to the wall. They took me away that same day. I started to worry. I had to work the next day. Don't worry, we'll tell them everything at work. You'll only be here 2 days and then we will return you, they said. Well, that 2 days turned into 597 days.
His wife has been looking for him the whole time and even reported his disappearance to the police. But the police could not find him either. The Ukrainian Security Service also responded, saying that they had never detained this person. Shichman himself states that for almost all of this time he was being held at the Kharkiv department of the SBU in the now defunct compound.
They put me in front of a prison cell. Take off the bag on your head. I took the bag off. I watched the door open in front of me. I go in and there are 15 people. The cell is small and the guys are unshaven. My first impression was, where am I? The guy started smiling and asked, are you a separatist? Yes, I'm a separatist, I told them. Don't worry, we're all friends here. At that moment, there were 13 of us in one cell. After that, they squeezed in more and made it 17. At times, we had to sleep in shifts. One person sleeps in the afternoon, and the other uses the same bed to sleep at night.
Viktor Shukhmin says that Mykola Vakaruk, his fellow townsman and a colleague from the mine, was kept at the same prison. In May 2014, Vakaruk put a DPR flag on top of the Ukrainsk City Council.
I was detained on December 9th. 4 people with no chevrons, no other identification at all. Black uniforms, black balaclavas. We arrived to Kharkiv on December 23rd and were summoned for interrogation. I was so happy, from basements, from battalions to a legal environment. But no such luck. The investigators looked at the documents and said, what's the point of reading them? Any lawyer can prove it's nonsense. As in, that I will be exchanged.
According to Vakaruk, Konstantin Beskorovainy was also in that cell. Beskorovainy is a communist, a member at the Konstantinivka City Council in Donetsk region. Just like Vakaruk and Shukhmin, Beskorovainy also claims that during his detention, he was kicked and tortured.
They threatened that they would shoot me to death or put something up my buttocks, or take me to a prison in Korostan that is full of tuberculosis and AIDS. I had a stroke, and after this, doctors came to see me wearing masks.
And while with Vakaruk and Shukhmin, there were no mentions of their detention, the SBU did report on Beskorovainy's detention.
The counterintelligence under Ukraine's security service detained a member of the Konstantinivka City Council in the Donetsk region. This crazy communist, along with other criminals detained, wanted to contaminate the water reservoirs of Konstantinivka with potassium cyanide.
But even 15 months after this SBU report, Beskorovainy's wife still had no idea where her husband disappeared to.
I made so many appeals, around 100 perhaps, and I received nothing but a kilogram of water back, a kilogram of rejections, a kilogram of lies.
He was like a ghost. There were no reports about his detention, about his arrest. His name wasn't mentioned anywhere. We made appeals to the SBU while we were preparing this report. What do you know about Mr. Beskorovainy? We asked them. Nothing at all. We didn't detain him. His name never popped up. We don't know anything, they replied.
Konstantin Beskorovainy got back home to Konstantinivka in February 2016. In July of the same year, Shukhmin and Vakaruk returned to Ukrainsk.
One by one, they summoned us to the office on the 4th floor. There we had to write that we promised not to disclose the locations we were kept in, and that we confessed to our actions, that we were just recruited and we are SBU officers. If we didn't sign it, we wouldn't be able to walk free. But we had already spent so long there that we were happy to agree with anything just so that we could go home. They took us in the direction of Izium. We ourselves did not know where we were taken to. Is it an exchange? Not an exchange? They left us in between Kramatorsk and Drushkivka and gave us each 100 hryvnia and our documents. And I asked them, what about the documents about where we were kept? Tell them you were on a work trip, they said while handing over the 100 hryvnia. What great pay, I retorted, 100 hryvnia for 600 days.
Both Shukhmin and Vakaruk never denied the crimes committed in May 2014, but they were angry about the fact that the accusation was not official.
If they had sentenced me for carrying out this referendum, I would have served the sentence. I would have at least known when I'd get home. My wife would have come to visit me, would have brought me things. We would have had conversations, dates, but instead we didn't see each other for 600 days.
Striking testimonies not often seen on major Ukrainian TV screens. And I stand corrected. Angelina Karakina is not one of the authors of the film, but as the editor-in-chief of Hromadske, she ultimately holds responsibility for everything that is shown on Hromadske TV. So, Angelina, how sure you are that what you have shown, what you have made public in this film is actually true? Are there any verification means in your disposal?
Well, it actually took us some time to check the evidence that was disclosed, so to say, by these people. We have broadcasted these interviews by these people almost 2 years ago, but it took us really some time to go to the compound itself and then to check the evidence. Unfortunately, in this small piece that it was just shown, broadcasted, it didn't show the main part, where we go to the compound and where we check those little things. And those little things, I myself and our team, we consider them the main evidence. So these people were telling us about things that you can just only know if you live for a certain period of time
if you were there
in this place. So it's not only the layout of the rooms, how they are situated, it's also small things like a small hole in a polycarbonate on the window in 2 cells. We went there, we checked it, so our audience, our viewers can check it on the video and just see the whole investigation. We also checked some small things like cables and taps for water in the corridor. So it's just a number of things that has been checked, and it gives us reasons to state that these compounds really existed and these people were really held there. The other fact that is new, so to say, because these people are not new, again, the evidence that they were stating is not really new. We interviewed Mr. Vakaruk, who is there, Mykola Vakaruk from Ukrainsk, and he told us that he had, while he was held in one of the compounds in Kharkiv compound of SBU, he had some problems with kidneys and he had to be taken to a hospital, and that SBU officers were with him all the time. He had a surgery and he stayed there for almost a month. So we took Vakaruk and we went to that specific hospital just to see where the staff of this hospital would recognize him, and they did recognize him. Not only they recognized him, saying, "Hi, you look better, we do remember you," and a year has passed, so they do really remember this man. They also remember the name that he was there. It's a fake name.
But was there any medical record of him being there?
We weren't able to find this record. We weren't able to get some paper from the hospital, but we were talking extensively to the chief doctor, and everything that we could get was this, this simple reaction from the staff saying that, yes, we do remember you. We remember that you were Ivanov, not Vakaruk, and this is the fact that he was saying, and we also consider this evidence enough to state that this thing really happened. And it's also quite hard to make up this whole story from the beginning to the end.
Angelina, I remember then that when the story was broken 2 years ago, SBU denied it, but they were not particularly vocal in denying it. It looked like they were doing this out of obligation, that they had to deny it. Wasn't it a sort of a tacit recognition of the existence of those detention centers?
Well,
what's your feeling?
Formally, you cannot say so, because formally they were denying it all the time. Even now, today, our crew, by chance, met the head of the security service, Vasil Hrytsak.
Or was it the head of the security service who met your crew?
We don't know that. That's a good question, though. So we asked him whether he saw that investigation. He said he did not, but no compounds ever existed, so he denied once again. What we know is that if we take the timeline of the events, so first the international organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, got the information that these people were held in the secret compounds. They had a meeting with, if I'm not mistaken, with military prosecution office and also with the security service, and they did say that these people need to go home and that it's illegal to hold them like that. And later, in some short time, several people were let free. They couldn't state that, I mean, they weren't they weren't standing there and shooting as it was happening, but they did really found people who said that they were let free approximately at this time.
Earlier we spoke with Principal Deputy Chief Monitor of the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine, Alexander Hug, and about the investigation. Let's take a look. Again,
the broadcast by Hromadske TV has made such allegations, and journalists, so we believe, have a key role in reporting on issues of public interest, such as possible human rights violations. The ability, furthermore, of independent media to investigate and publish the results of that investigation in accordance with national legislation and international commitments without fear of persecution and prosecution, physical harm, is a basic component of a democratic society. The commitments of the OSCE participating states in the field of freedom of media are a reminder that independent media and pluralistic media are essential to free and open society and accountable systems of government, and are of particular importance in safeguarding human rights and fundamental freedoms. All measures agreed in Minsk, including the exchange of prisoners, detainees and hostages, require mutual trust on either side. That trust needs to be built and can only be built if measures that are being implemented transparent. The Special Monitoring Mission assists in this process by providing objective information that the sides may use to build that trust. It is important that these offers that the mission offers in terms of dialogue, in terms of facilitating dialogue, are being used, and people, stakeholders, sides participate in good faith in this dialogue. As I mentioned before, credible allegations of human rights violations should be looked into carefully by the competent authorities. It is not for me to comment on behalf of those authorities, but once again, the commitments of the OSCE participating states in the field of freedom of media are a reminder that independent media and pluralistic media are essential to free and open society and accountable systems of government, and are of particular importance in safeguarding human rights and fundamental freedoms.
The investigation of Hromadske of the allegations that the SBU, the security service of Ukraine, had secret detention facilities lasted for almost 18 months. Angelina Karakina, chief editor of Hromadske, what was the level of attempts to hold you back from this investigation?
There were no attempts to hold us back, actually. The only thing that was holding us back from doing our job was the fact that we couldn't get to the facility itself. So it took us a lot of work and a lot of, let's say, networking as well, to reach head of the security service, Mr. Kuciak, and to ask him personally to grant us this permission and to go inside the facility, because it was only once open to the media, and unfortunately was only open for the local media who were there, because Mr. Kuciak decided to pay this visit unexpectedly by surprise in September 2016, and of course we were not there, and lots of central media were not there. Lots of media who have been covering this case were not there. So we have been asking for almost half a year to get there, and then finally we got that permission.
While listening to people who gave interviews to Hromadske, I paid attention to the fact that they were made to provide written obligations to the SBU not to disclose the location or some other details. But they actually overstepped this obligation in their interviews to you. What may be the consequences for them?
Well, we all understand that everything that happened to these people, and be it any formal or informal commitments they were doing both ways, it's just everything in a very, very fragile legal environment, so to say. If I may use another word, I would, but I just don't have this word. So according to the Secret Service, to the Security Service, there were no facilities. So these people were never held there. So they had no status, so they have no obligations whatsoever. But another interesting fact, and I think we really have to stress it, if these people were, as you said, they were accused of wrongdoings that may pose a threat to Ukrainian territorial integrity, why haven't there been any charges pressed against them? So we know that at least 3 of them were somehow helping or collaborating with the militants. One of them was helping organize the referendum, so-called referendum. Another was hanging out the flag of the so-called DPR, Donetsk People's Republic, and the others were helping militants in their hometowns. So why there were no official charges? This is a question for the Security Service and also for the Prosecution Office and Military Prosecution Office, and I really hope that this investigation will bring this question again, and I really hope that they will renew this investigation.
Well, both as a presenter at Hromadske International and as a viewer, I am quite sure that the team will investigate further. And Angelina Karakina, editor-in-chief, has said here that regrettably we've seen only just a fragment of the film. Well, watch the full documentary, read the story on our webpage. Also sign up for our brand new newsletter if you would like to receive Hromadske International's weekly highlights. The sign-up box is on the upper right-hand side of the site. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook, search Hromadske International, and we will be back in the studio in a sec. Anti-government protests are sweeping Slovakia following the killing of an investigative journalist and his partner in February. Jan Kuciak was investigating government links to the Italian mafia at the time of his murder. The protests, which are now in their 3rd week, have prompted the resignation of Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico. But demonstrators say this isn't enough to address the nation's deep-seated corruption. Hromadske spoke with Strategic and Security Studies Group expert Olexia Basarab about the uprising against the government.
Well, these protests is not something unexpected in Slovakia, because the political situation was pretty tense for a pretty long period, and there was a number of political scandals dealt with corruption on the highest level of Slovak government. There were scandals, for example, dealt with organized crime, working with schemes on illegal VAT returns, and all the journalistic investigations were leading to the top officials of ruling political party Smer. So during the last year and before, there were from time to time there were organized political protests, anti-corruption rallies, and so on. The murder of investigative journalist created a kind of point that made this situation to boil, because in Slovakia there was kind of public consent that this country is pretty safe, and this country was pretty safe for journalists. If we recall the country's history, in 30 years there were only three cases when journalists disappeared. There were no murders, there were no beatings of journalists. The usual modus operandi were to act against journalists was the judicial way. So cases in courts, defamation cases, and so on. And the murder of journalists, and moreover, together with his fiancée, young people, 27 years old, who had no record of some political involvement. They were just professionals. Jan Kuciak was analyst who was working with open sources, open data, analyzing economic records, and creating the more wide picture of how politically tied business works in Slovakia. So there are two. Let me say that we can talk about two moments which joined. So first of all, this long period of really strong political conflict between ruling party and people supporting the opposition, and on the other hand, the moral problem, the problem of murdered young people. And actually, if a government would act more logically and more professionally, there would not be so big political crisis if the investigation was carried out properly. But unfortunately, from the very first day, the investigation was carried out in pretty improper way. This was acknowledged also by European Parliament delegation visiting Slovakia during last week, and they also acknowledged that the police investigation did not follow some standard procedures. So the other problem was that Jan Kuciak was also writing about some pretty suspicious business connections of the very Minister of Interior, Robert Kalinyak, about the police president, Tibor Gaspar, and about business of wife of the chef of National Anti-Corruption Agency, Crimea. So the problem was that all these leading persons in law enforcement, they were somehow dealt with the suspicious business schemes and with the ruling party, and they were now leading the investigation of murder of journalists who was writing about their problematic connections.
When Russia instigated war in eastern Ukraine 4 years ago, this country's armed forces were unprepared, suffering defeat after defeat in the east. Since then, the Ukrainian military has undergone major reforms. Part of its transformation has been thanks to Ukraine's foreign allies, such as Canada, which continues to support Ukraine's military. The Northern American ally has offered invaluable help in training Ukraine's armed forces as part of the Joint Task Force Ukraine program. Hromadske interviewed 4 Canadian soldiers who have just finished their training rotation in Ukraine about their experience in this country.
What is the most essential for the Ukrainian army?
Well, with all due respect, I don't think you could say one thing that the Ukrainian military needs. But if you were going to boil it down, you would say the support of the people of Ukraine. You know, Ukraine is fighting a crisis in the east while it's trying to reform its entire governmental structure, including its military. So Canada's here as a partner. We're bringing experience here, and we're slowly building up your capability. The Ukrainian military is unrecognizable from 2014. It is incredibly more powerful and more capable.
What are the exact things you should think are necessary to improve?
You know, your equipment, some of it needs to be modernized. Your soldiers are paid well, but they probably need to be paid more. There's also the ability for your military organizations to learn how to fight together, either in the east or to train more.
What would be the things you've learned while being here, and what do you think the knowledge you've given to the Ukrainian soldiers?
So I actually have the unique privilege of working with some of the guys that are actively trying to capture lessons from the veterans as they come out of the ATO. And so we've learned a lot about how modify communications and how to modify their actions in the presence of UAVs. And so we've been working together to try and address new tactics to deal with that.
What was your experience with working with the Ukrainian police?
It was really good. All Ukrainians I've worked with are always very friendly. They're very keen to get to know the person before they get into dealing with the job, which I think is something a bit different from our army, where we tend to jump right into doing a task and not necessarily spending the time to get to know each other. So I think that's a big difference.
What new knowledge you have brought?
What we've tried to do is to build on top of what they do and try to take the best practices out of what they do and incorporate some more of us, and then to increase the survivability of soldiers when they go out there and do their job.
What you've learned while being here?
So one of the things I've learned basically is to bridge that gap and get in there and share myself, and then to start a foundation, then we can build further from there.
And we also would like to, if you can ask a question about your experience while being here.
I'm the J5, I'm the plans officer. What we do is we attend meetings with the general staff of Ukraine, and from there they identify to us, in accordance with the Security Defense Bulletin, their reform goals. And then Canada takes those reform goals from the Ukrainians back, and we look at the capacity that we have, the capability that we have on the ground in accordance with our strategic guidance, and we figure out the best way to assist the Ukrainians in their reform goals. Ukraine is very eager and they're very motivated to change. They have a professional army that is very capable. They're very skilled, and the motivation and that their want, their desire is critical for us. So for me, Canada can't do it alone. We have such a big footprint and such a capacity here, but without the Lithuanians, the Poles, the Americans, and the Brits, us all working together holistically to help Ukraine achieve those defense reform goals, that no country would be able to achieve those effects without working together.
What message you would pass to your to the new rotation?
We're not trying to make it Canadian. We're not trying to make it from the UK point of view or the US point of view. We're trying to take our skill sets and enable them. So we have to let the Ukrainians have a voice. They have means, and there's so much substantiation behind why they do things a certain way, what their mentality is, that cultural piece, and you have to respect that, even though it differs from us. But that's why I think Canada is so important here, is because we have such a large Ukrainian diaspora back in Canada, and the ties are very deep. So for us, it's quite interesting respecting that culture and being able to apply our effects in a positive manner here.
Difference you seem like which is needed to be respected.
Right, Ukraine has been the borders of Ukraine have been disputed since the 1100s. For us, our borders have not been as disrupted and so controversial. So Ukraine has expanded and shrunk over centuries, and that makes you guys who you are. So us as Canadians coming in and respecting that piece of your culture is very important.
Well, this is basically it for tonight. Thank you from the entire team of Hromadske International. We're here to explain Ukraine and Eastern Europe for you. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and good night.